European history. The League of Nations 1920-1945. The League of Nations 1920-1945. The League of Nations was an international organization that was formed on 10 January 1920 with its headquarters at Geneva in Switzerland. The idea of forming the League of Nations was brought up by President Woodrow Wilson of USA during the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, and it was accepted by other leaders of the victor powers of World War I. At the start, the League of Nations had 42 member states, but by 1926, when Germany was admitted, it had 55 members. Objectives of the League of Nations. The League of Nations had the following objectives to achieve: to maintain or keep international peace order, to settle disputes between nations through arbitration, to guarantee or safeguard the sovereignty of the newly independent member states, to promote international cooperation among the member states, to alleviate address international social and economic problems so as to improve social welfare of the masses in the member states, to effect disarmament and check on rearmament by the aggressive powers, to administer the mandated territories, to check on illicit trade and drug trafficking. The organs of the League of Nations. In order to achieve the above objectives, the member states of the League of Nations set up the following administrative organs. The General Assembly. This had all the members of the League of Nations. Each state was represented and had one vote in the Assembly. It met once a year and all the decisions had to be taken as agreed upon by the majority members. One of its functions was that it considered the conditions which threatened the peace of the world, and it's the General Assembly that elected the 15 judges of the International Court of Justice. The Security Council of the League of Nations. This served as the executive. It consisted of 5 permanent members picked from the victorious powers, which included Britain, France, Japan, Italy and USA. However, at the beginning, USA did not join the League of Nations, and therefore the Council initially had 4 members. The Council had to make plans to reduce arms and also to look for ways or measures to be taken by the League of Nations against external aggressions that were directed towards the member states. 8. European history. The League of Nations 1920-1945. This was the permanent civil service of the League of Nations, and it was headed by a Secretary General, and it had its headquarters in Geneva. The Secretariat dealt with the day-to-day administrative work of the League of Nations. The Permanent Court, or the International Court of Justice. This court was set up in the city of Hague in Netherlands. It consisted of 15 judges, and the court elected a president from amongst its members. The court was to settle international conflicts between the member states, and a member submitting any dispute to that court had to promise in advance that it would accept any judgment the court would take. Besides the above administrative organs, the League of Nations also had other specialized agencies or committees like the International Labour Organization, the World Health Organization, the Intellectual Organization and the Mandates Commission, among others. Note: the League of Nations was to maintain peace through the following measures: settling conflicts using the International Court of Justice, use of economic sanctions on problematic countries, use of the system of collective responsibility where every member had to share the responsibility of defending the other members from external aggression, the use of force, and this is when sanctions failed, such that the member states would contribute or just so that the aggressive state is forced to stop attacking the other state. If the aggressor was a member of the League of Nations, then she would be expelled from the League of Nations. Achievements or successes of the League of Nations. The League of Nations succeeded in increasing its membership. At the start, the League of Nations had 42 members, but this number had increased to 55 states by 1930 following the admission of new members into the League. For example, Germany was admitted in 1926 and later Russia in 1934. By widening or increased its membership, the League of Nations was able to increase international cooperation, which was one of its objectives. Its survival for 19 years was an incredible achievement. Formed in 1920, the League of Nations managed to survive for 19 years without collapsing up to 1939 when World War II broke out. It met several challenges during this period, like the presence of aggressive states, but it persisted despite the challenges. It improved the conditions of the workers all over the world through the formation of the International Labour Organization (ILO). Through the ILO, the League of Nations persuaded governments to fix the maximum working hours, specify adequate minimum wage, and introduce sickness and unemployment benefits as well as old age pensions. These standards that were set by European history. The League of Nations 1920-1945. The League of Nations rehabilitated the European economies that had been destroyed by World War I. In the first 4 years of its operation, the League of Nations provided financial assistance or aid in form of loans to the war-torn countries that had been devastated by World War I. These included like Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria and Greece, among others. This financial assistance brought about rapid economic recovery in the above countries, which helped them to overcome the adverse economic effects of World War I. The League of Nations was instrumental in addressing the plight suffering of the refugees through the formation of the Refugee Organization. World War I created a problem of caring for and resettling of millions of displaced people or refugees. By 1934, the League of Nations had extended relief assistance to almost 4 million people in this category. A majority of these refugees were Russians and Greeks. For example, it returned 500,000 people home and gave relief assistance to thousands of people fleeing the Nazi persecution in Germany. Similarly, the League of Nations settled the issue of the prisoners of war that had been captured during the course of World War I. For example, between 1920 and 1925, it successfully repatriated all the prisoners of war to their mother countries, and this was a major achievement. It improved the health standards in Europe through the formation of the World Health Organization, who in 1923. Through this agency, the League of Nations organized medical assistance and distribution of vaccines to combat the epidemics of typhus, cholera, dysentery, malaria, smallpox, leprosy, heart disease and others which had swept across Europe before, during and after World War I. Important research was also carried out in various epidemic diseases, and conferences were organized to improve on the health standards of the member states of the League of Nations. This was therefore an important achievement of the League of Nations. The League of Nations succeeded in improving transport and communication among the member states. This was through the formation of the Communication and Transport Organization in 1920. This organization established guidelines like the Highway Code and other maritime laws that encouraged freedom of transport between states as well as free navigation on the international waterways. This was an important achievement, especially in the direction of maintaining peace and stability in Europe after World War I. It removed the social evil of slavery, which was rampant during the course of World War I. This was through the formation of the Slavery Commission in 1924, which led to the end of slave trade and slavery in Europe. In addition, the League of Nations attempted to check or control human and drug trafficking in the world. It arrested the human and drug traffickers, destroyed drugs, and even confiscated the human and drug trafficking ships. Through these measures, the problem of human and drug trafficking was lessened in the world after World War I. The League of Nations reconciled Germany with other powers, especially her former World War I enemies of Britain and France. This was through the signing of international treaties like Locarno Treaties of 1925. These were agreements negotiated at Locarno, Switzerland on 5-6 October 1925 and formally signed in London on 1 December 1925, in which Britain and France agreed to normalise their relations with the defeated Germany. This therefore restored friendship between Germany and her former enemies, thus promoting international diplomacy in Europe. European history. The League of Nations 1920-1945 was signed by 65 states, including defeated Germany. All the signatories to this pact pronounced or outlawed war as an instrument of national policy. They therefore pledged themselves not to fight each other except in self-defense. This therefore promoted peace and international cooperation among the European powers, which was an incredible achievement or success by the League of Nations. The League of Nations succeeded in promoting human rights. It should be remembered that World War I had interfered with the freedom and rights of people in Europe. For example, during the course of the war, there was forceful conscription in countries like Britain, France and Germany, as well as massive killing of people among other human rights violations. As a result, after World War I, the League of Nations established the International Court of Justice (ICJ) at Hague in 1921 to defend human rights. By 1926, this court had settled 26 cases related to human rights violation, and by 1939 it had presided over 400 treaties aimed at promoting human rights in the member countries. The League of Nations promoted education and intellectual cooperation among the member states. It set up the Intellectual Organization or Committee based in Paris, through which League of Nations organized conferences and published materials in support of collective security, where every member had the responsibility of ensuring disarmament. This committee, which brought together intellectuals, also published materials to arouse public opinion against war. Through the same agency or committee, the League of Nations promoted child welfare by checking on the trade in obscene literature. It also discouraged child labor, as well as campaigning for good health and education for the children in the member states. The League of Nations successfully administered the mandated territories through the mandates, a mission which it set up. These were the territories that were formerly under the control of Germany and Turkey, but which were given to the victorious powers after World War I to administer them on behalf of the League of Nations. Such territories included Tanganyika, Cameroon, Togo, Namibia, Syria, Iraq and Iran. The Mandates Commission supervised the governments of these former German and Turkish colonies and used to make reports about how those former colonies were being administered, and if a country that controlled the former colony was found practicing poor administration, the country would be forced to improve on the administration in the colony. Similarly, the League of Nations succeeded in administering the Sahel region. It should be remembered that the Saar region had been annexed by France from Germany at the end of World War I as a compensation for the damages of the coal mines in the northeast of France and also as part payment for the total reparations that Germany had to pay to the Allied powers. This region was rich in coal and its annexation had created bitterness among the Germans. As a result, in 1935 the League of Nations organized a plebiscite or referendum and the people of this region voted for their return to Germany. Therefore, the League of Nations controlled events in the Saar region, which was an important achievement. The League of Nations succeeded in maintaining world peace in the 1920s, which was one of its major objectives. It managed to settle conflicts or disputes that involved small states. Over 40 political disputes were handled, some by the General Assembly and the Security Council of the European history. The League of Nations 1920-1945 ruled that the territory belonged to Finland and Sweden accepted the ruling, and therefore the possibility of war between the two countries was avoided. In 1921, the League of Nations settled a conflict between Germany and Poland over the ownership of Upper Silesia, which was a rich territory on the border of the two countries. To avert war, the League of Nations divided Upper Silesia between Germany and Poland, leaving a greater part to Germany, and both parties accepted the ruling, which avoided the possibility of a war between the two countries. In 1925-1926, the League of Nations settled the frontier border dispute between Greece and Bulgaria in the Balkans. Because of the intervention of the League of Nations, Greece was forced to withdraw from the area and pay damages or fine to Bulgaria. In 1926, the League of Nations settled a conflict between Turkey and Iraq over the oil-rich Mosul province, which Turkey had forcefully occupied, yet it belonged to Iraq. The League of Nations decided or ruled in favor of Iraq, and Turkey accepted the ruling. In 1931, a dispute arose between Greece and Yugoslavia regarding the boundary of Albania. The possibility of war loomed so high, but the League intervened in the matter and reconciled both parties by mutual discussion. There was a dispute between Turkey and Iraq, ruled over by Great Britain over the control of the Mosul area, which was rich in oil on the Iraq-Turkish border. The two countries claimed the territory. In 1926, the League of Nations intervened and drew the boundary line, giving a greater part of it to Iraq. Turkey protested, but in vain. The League of Nations successfully settled the conflict between Peru and Colombia over Leticia in South America. In 1922, Peru surrendered control of Leticia to Colombia. However, in 1933, Peru invaded Colombia and captured Leticia. The League set a commission of inquiry into the crisis. The commission investigated and recommended that Leticia should be handed over to Colombia. This was implemented and the matter permanently settled. Failures of the League of Nations. The League of Nations failed to maintain the membership, especially of some key members, which instead withdrew from the League as time went on. For example, in 1933 Japan and Germany withdrew from the League of Nations, and in 1935 Italy also withdrew her membership. The withdrawal of these member states greatly affected the functioning of the Security Council of the League of Nations, because they started conducting actions like aggression which undermined the operations of the League of Nations. It failed to win or secure the membership of some major powers like USA and Russia. Right from the start, the League of Nations was supposed to incorporate all the major world powers, but unfortunately some countries, due to their selfish interests, refused to join this organization. For example, although it was the American President Woodrow Wilson who brought up the idea of forming the League of Nations, the Americans refused to support America's membership to the organization. Even Russia was not a member of the League of Nations until 1934 when she joined, but this was rather too late. These were powerful states the world that would have greatly helped in the implementation of the resolutions of the League of Nations. European history. The League of Nations 1920-1945. Even though they had signed and agreed to the Covenant of the League of the Nations. For example, in 1935 Adolf Hitler announced conscription in Germany and also announced a new massive program of rearming Germany. These measures were violating the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919, but the League of Nations failed to force him to abandon them. This revived the arms race in Europe, as other countries also manufactured weapons and increased the size of their armies, which eventually sparked off World War II in 1939. The League of Nations failed to protect the democratic governments in Europe from being overthrown by dictators. For example, in Germany, the Democratic Weimar Republic that had been established in 1919 following the abdication of Kaiser William Roman II was overthrown by Adolf Hitler in 1933, while in Italy the liberal government under King Victor Emmanuel Roman III was overthrown by Benito Mussolini in 1922. The same was true in Spain, where General Franco, with the support of Hitler and Mussolini, overthrew the constitutional monarchy in 1936 and established a fascist regime there. The League of Nations failed to improve the social and economic welfare of the nations outside Europe, even if these nations were full member states. Though the League of Nations was meant to be an international organization, its member states outside Europe, like those in Africa such as Ethiopia continued to suffer from social and economic problems like poverty. This was a major failure on the part of the League of Nations. The League of Nations failed to win the sympathy of the European nationals of even the member states, which greatly contributed to its failure. For the League of Nations to achieve its objectives, the citizens of the member states were supposed to be part of its operations, which was not the case. Instead, it was dominated by the leaders of the leading member states like Britain and France, without including the views and opinions of the grassroots or common people. As a result, the local population rejected some of the core principles of the League of Nations. For example, the British people opposed the Geneva Protocol of 1920, which established the League of Nations, and preferred the Locarno Treaties of 1925. The League of Nations failed to prevent the rise of dictators in the world. The 1920s and 1930s witnessed the rise of several dictators in the world like Adolf Hitler of Germany, Tojo Hirohito of Japan, Benito Mussolini of Italy, and General Franco of Spain. These rulers ended up establishing authoritarian or dictatorial systems like fascism and Nazism, among others, in their respective countries, which created a difficult environment for the League of Nations to operate. As dictators, these rulers were also very much determined to fight against the democratic states like Britain, France and USA, which were trying to defend the spread of democracy in the world. This therefore undermined the League's efforts to maintain world peace. It failed to avert the Spanish Civil War of 1936–1939. In 1931, a civil war broke out in Spain, which led to the overthrow of the monarchical regime. General Franco copied this example and also rose up in arms against the Republican government in Spain. Therefore, from 1936–1939, there was a bloody confrontation in Spain between General Franco's rebels backed by Italy and Germany against the Spanish Republican government backed by Russia, Britain, and France. The League of Nations did nothing and was inactive over this bloody Spanish war. Moreover, Britain and France, the most influential members of the League, took sides and supported Spain. The League is therefore further. European history. The League of Nations 1920–1945. Countries claimed the territory or city of Vilna, which was located at their common border. In 1920, Poland declared Vilna as its territory, and this act worsened the relationship between Poland and Lithuania. However, because the League of Nations was overruled by a conference of ambassadors based in Paris on this incident, it failed to resolve the conflict between the two countries. The League of Nations failed to restrain or stop military aggression in the world. For example, it failed to avert the aggression of Japan on China. In 1931, the Japanese army invaded and occupied the northern province of China known as Manchuria. The League of Nations requested Japan to withdraw after the failure of economic and military sanctions that it had imposed on Japan. Instead, in 1933, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations and no action was taken. This was a big failure of the League of Nations for not keeping Japan in the League. It also failed to stop the Italian attack on Corfu, which was an island for Greece. During this incident, Benito Mussolini, who was the Prime Minister of Italy, invaded the Greek island of Corfu as a revenge to the Greeks who had shot and killed some Italian soldiers at their border. Greece appealed to the League of Nations, but it did nothing to force Italy out of the island. Instead, Italy forced Greece to pay 50 million liras as compensation. It also failed to stop the Italian invasion of Abyssinia or Ethiopia, and this was a serious blow to the League's prestige and credibility. On 3 October 1935, Benito Mussolini of Italy invaded Ethiopia to avenge the defeat of Italy in the Battle of Adwa of 1896 by the Ethiopians under Emperor Menelik Roman II. The Ethiopian emperor, by then Haile Selassie, personally presented his case to the League of Nations in Geneva, but the League of Nations failed to force Italy out of Ethiopia. This was because the economic sanctions that were imposed on Italy did not include oil and coal. These were major energy sources that would have forced Italy out of Ethiopia. It also failed to stop German aggression in Europe. After coming to power in Germany in 1933, Adolf Hitler set out upon to violate the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919, which he considered unfair to Germany by invading several small states in Europe. For example, on 7 March 1936, Adolf Hitler sent the German troops to occupy the Rhineland territory, which had been declared by the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 as a demilitarized zone where Germany was not allowed to station her troops. However, the League of Nations failed to force Germany out of this zone. It also failed to stop the German invasion of Austria in 1938, Czechoslovakia in 1939, and finally Poland in September 1939. The League of Nations therefore failed to guarantee or protect the independence of the member states, and yet this was one of its major objectives. The League of Nations failed to win the support and sympathy of the small states. The League of Nations was meant to be an international organization of all countries in the world and was supposed to cater for their interests irrespective of their size. Unfortunately, the organization was dominated by the big powers of the day, and the major decisions in the League were always made and determined by the victorious powers of World War I, especially Britain and France. As a result, the small states like Ethiopia and Liberia refused to associate themselves with the League, and they instead conducted actions that were against the League of Nations. The League of Nations failed to totally eradicate the problem of drug trafficking in the world. Despite all the efforts put in by the League to fight this illegal practice, like arresting of the drug traffickers. European history, the League of Nations 1920-1945. The League of Nations failed to form a joint force for keeping peace in the world. This was because the member countries failed to contribute forces that could be used to create an independent army and navy. This joint force would be used to enforce the resolutions of the League, as well as fighting against European aggressors like Italy and Germany. For example, in 1935, Benito Mussolini obviously attacked Ethiopia, but nothing was done to force him out of Ethiopia. This lack of a joint force clearly indicated that the League of Nations was a weak organization, thus making it unable to achieve its objectives. It failed to stop the revival of the alliance system in Europe. The League of Nations was supposed to ensure collective effort among the member states, especially in matters concerning international peace and security, but which it was unable to achieve this. Consequently, a number of alliances were formed in the interwar period which revived the alliance system. For example, there was the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo Axis, or alliance of the dictatorial countries that stood against the democratic states of France, USA and Britain, among others. This weakened the League because it failed to control the activities of such hostile alliances. The League of Nations failed to avert the economic depression of 1929-1935. The World Economic Depression was the period when the world experienced a slump crush and a general recession collapse in the economies of the individual states, or when the economic variables such as savings, incomes, investments, employment opportunities, prices and wages were all at their lowest. This depression broke out because the League of Nations failed to implement economic policies necessary for free trade. For example, it failed to stop the economic protectionism that was pursued by USA, which made it difficult for European countries that had surplus to sell to USA. This shattered international trade, which left many goods in Europe unbought, thus leading to the outbreak of the Great Economic Depression in 1929. The League of Nations failed to avert or prevent the outbreak of another world war. The military and economic weaknesses of the League of Nations encouraged Adolf Hitler of Germany to invade Poland on 1 September 1939 because he expected no resistance at all. Hitler wanted to annex the Polish territory, which are Germans, and also to take over the port of Danzig, which the Versailles Peace Treaty of 199 had declared a free city under the League of Nations. When this happened, Britain and France declared war on Germany on 3 September 1939 so as to save their ally Poland, which sparked off World War II. Reasons why the League of Nations failed to achieve the objectives of its founders. The League of Nations was a product of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points and was therefore born out of the Versailles Peace Settlement of 1919 after World War I. He suggested the creation of an international organization to maintain peace, which was accepted, and therefore on 10 January 1920 the League of Nations was officially launched in Geneva. The objectives of the League of Nations included to maintain peace and security through collective security or responsibility, to promote international cooperation in order to solve the economic problems. European history, the League of Nations 1920-1945, to address the refugee problem, to administer the mandated territories. The League of Nations was bound to fail, and indeed it failed to achieve the above objectives due to the following reasons. The isolation of USA undermined the League of Nations. Although it was President Woodrow Wilson of USA who initiated the League of Nations in 1920, the people of USA, especially the Republicans, opposed the inclusion of USA into the League of Nations because President Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat, did not take their views to the Paris Conference, which gave birth to the League of Nations. They therefore refused to approve USA's membership, and this was a major setback to the organization because it meant that the League of Nations had lost a huge source of military and economic support, and therefore it was bound to fail. The League of Nations failed because it lacked enough funds to finance its activities. The League of Nations as an organization entirely depended on the financial contributions from the member states. However, between 1920 and 1939 many member states were not willing to contribute money because they were still recovering from the adverse economic effects of World War I. Without enough financial resources, therefore, the League of Nations could not successfully implement its resolutions, thus leading to its failure. The League of Nations also failed because it lacked an independent army or joint force and navy to enforce its resolutions. The League of Nations depended on the forces from individual member states for its military operations and peacekeeping missions. Unfortunately, in the 1920s and 1930s, the member countries failed to contribute forces to form a joint force that could be used to fight against European aggressors like Italy and Germany. For example, in 1935 Benito Mussolini of Italy attacked Ethiopia, but nothing was done to force a mass of Ethiopia since the League of Nations had no standing army to perform that function. This was a clear indication that the League of Nations was weak. The absence of a number of big states in the League of Nations also greatly undermined its operation. At the start, the League of Nations excluded some big powers. For example, USSR was not a member until 1934, Germany was not a member between 1926 and 1933, while Italy became a member of the League between 1926 and 1935. These were great powers, and therefore their exclusion meant that the resolutions of the League of Nations were not binding on them. As a result, they called it a British-French League, which made it hard for the League of Nations to achieve its objectives. The principle of free entry and exit undermined the operation of the League of Nations. According to the structure of the League of Nations, the member states were free to enter and get out of the League without any restrictions. This weakness was therefore exploited by some member states to pull out of the League. For example, in 1933, the League of Nations asked Germany to observe its principle of disarmament, and in October 1933, Adolf Hitler refused and he instead withdrew Germany from the League of Nations. Russia also withdrew from the League of Nations in 1936. European history, the League of Nations 1920-1945. The association of the League of Nations with the harsh and unpopular Versailles Peace Treaty 1919 undermined its operation. The League of Nations was set up in 1920 in the aftermath of the Versailles Peace Treaty that had been signed in 1919 at the end of World War I between victorious powers and the defeated Germany. The terms of this treaty were considered too harsh and unfair by the Germans, and therefore they rejected them. As a result, when the League of Nations was formed in 1920, the defeated powers, especially Germany, associated the League of Nations with this unfair Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919. This therefore made the League of Nations unpopular among the defeated powers, which undermined its efforts to achieve the objectives of its founders like international cooperation. The League of Nations failed because it neglected of the independent states. The League of Nations was set up to protect the member states from external aggression, but it greatly failed in this area. For example, Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935 while Germany invaded Austria, Poland and Czechoslovakia. These were independent states which the League of Nations was supposed to protect, but it failed to use its system of collective security or responsibility against the aggressive powers. This therefore made the League of Nations unable to achieve its objectives like maintaining peace in the world. The failure of the disarmament policy was a major blow to the League of Nations. The League of Nations failed to disarm the big powers, yet this was one of its major objectives. For example, Adolf Hitler of Germany publicly denounced the Versailles Peace Treaty of 1919 and he introduced military conscription. He also started programs to manufacture deadly weapons to rearm Germany, but the League of Nations did nothing to stop him. This gave Germany confidence to destabilize world peace, which undermined the operation of the League of Nations. The rise of dictators in the world created a difficult environment for the League of Nations to operate, hence making it unable to achieve the objectives of its founders. During the 1920s and 1930s, a number of dictatorial rulers captured power in several states in the world. For example, there was Adolf Hitler of Germany, Tojo Hirohito of Japan, Benito Mussolini of Italy, and General Franco of Spain. The above dictators were very much determined to fight against the democratic states like Britain, France, and the USA, which were trying to defend the spread of democracy in the world. Indeed, in 1935 Hitler and Mussolini invaded Spain to install General Franco, a fascist, to power. This created instability in Europe, which undermined the operation of the League of Nations, thus leading to its failure. The revival of the alliance system weakened the League of Nations. After World War I, a number of hostile alliances were created in Europe which revived the alliance system. For example, in 1939, Britain, France and Turkey concluded an alliance to resist German aggression. Also in 1939, the three aggressors that included Japan, Italy and Germany signed an alliance known as the Rome-Berlin Tokyo Axis to work together as dictators in their foreign policies and to fight against the democratic states of France, USA and Britain. This divided the world, hence weakening the League of Nations as it failed to control the activities of these hostile alliances. The League of Nations lacked mass support, which made it unable to achieve its objectives. The League of Nations neglected the small and weak member states because the major decisions and European history, the League of Nations 1920-1945. The weaknesses in the structure of the League of Nations also made it unable to achieve the objectives of its founders. For example, the League of Nations was based on the principle of equality and representation, yet the members were not equal. For example, Britain was not equal to Liberia. Also, in the voting procedure, voting was done on the unanimous principle whereby all the member states in the council had to first agree over something before it could be implemented, which was difficult. This made it difficult for the League of Nations to achieve its objectives. The League of Nations also failed to achieve its objectives because it was very slow in decision-making. Although the League of Nations had clear objectives and methods to use in the implementation of the objectives with its headquarters in Geneva, it never immediately put them into practice. This was partly due to the fact that the League of Nations met few times in its lifetime. As a result, all its resolutions ending up remaining of paper without being put into action, and that is why it was referred to as a barking dog that could not bite, which eventually led to its failure. The selfish national interests at the expense of international interests undermined the work of the League of Nations, thus making it unable to achieve its objectives. When the League of Nations was in its operation, some states of the world promoted their selfish national rather than international interests. For example, USA refused to join the League of Nations at the very start for fear of the American soldiers who, in an attempt to create peace, would get involved in wars on the European continent that would lead to their death. This partly explains why USA refused to become a member of the League of Nations at the start, and yet she was a very powerful country with huge financial and military resources that would have greatly helped the League of Nations to achieve its objectives. The League of Nations also failed to achieve its objectives because it used ineffective or weak punishments against the offenders. The League of Nations had clear mechanisms of punishing any member states that violated its principles and objectives, but it never had the military and economic machinery to apply them to the maximum. For example, in 1935, Benito Mussolini occupied Ethiopia and Italy was declared the aggressor by the League. The League of Nations then imposed economic sanctions on Italy, hoping that it was to withdraw from Ethiopia. However, Italy did not feel these sanctions because oil and coal, the two major energy sources, were not included on the list. The Suez Canal also remained open to the Italian ships, and Italy continued to import oil and other items from Asia through the Suez Canal. There was disunity among the members of the League of Nations, which also made it unable to achieve its objectives. The principle of collective responsibility, where every member of the League of Nations had to share the responsibility of defending the other members from external aggression, failed to work on some occasion. This is illustrated by the incident of the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Countries like Austria, Albania and Switzerland refused to impose economic sanctions on Italy so as to force her out of Ethiopia, yet they were members of the League of Nations. Mussolini therefore went ahead and consolidated the Italian control over Ethiopia, which was an independent state. The League of Nations worked on false assumptions, which also made it unable to achieve its objectives. During its existence, the League of Nations used and worked on some assumptions in order to achieve its objectives, but unfortunately some of these assumptions were false. For example, it worked. European history, the League of Nations, 1920–1945. The outbreak of the Great Economic Depression in 1929 further weakened the League of Nations, thus contributing to its failure. From 1929, Europe was faced with a depression because there were many goods but less money to purchase them. This economic depression undermined the work of the League of Nations of promoting international relations because countries imposed very high taxes on the imports from other countries and abolished free trade. This increased enmity among the European powers, which any hopes for lasting peace in Europe. The ideological differences even among the victorious powers themselves, which were members of the League of Nations, affected the operation of the League of Nations. For example, there was little cooperation between communist Russia and the Western capitalist countries of Europe like France and Britain. That's why Russia was not a member of the League of Nations until 1934. Above all, some states were dictatorial while others were democratic. For example, France and Britain supported the policies of democracy, yet Italy, Japan, Germany and Spain were despotic or dictatorial countries. The magnitude of the problems of Europe made the League of Nations unable to succeed. Between 1920 and 1939, Europe witnessed civil, social, economic problems which largely a result of World War, and yet the League of Nations was supposed to address all of them. For example, there was inflation, unemployment, as well as a refugee crisis. These problems overwhelmed the League of Nations, thus making it unable to maintain peace in Europe up to 1939. The appeasement policy of Britain and France created difficulties for the League of Nations to operate. In the 1920s and 1930s, Britain and France pursued or practiced a policy of appeasement, which was based on the wrong assumption of satisfying the two European dictators of Hitler and Mussolini so as to prevent them from engaging in acts of aggression and prevent the outbreak of another world war in Europe. For example, it was because of this policy that Britain and France allowed Benito Mussolini to take over Ethiopia in 1935. Unfortunately, this policy undermined the operation of the League of Nations because it just encouraged aggression by Mussolini of Italy and Hitler of Germany, which undermined peace in Europe. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 was the final blow to the League of Nations. Due to the failure of the League of Nations to protect the independent states, Adolf Hitler of Germany invaded Poland in 1939. Then, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and this was the beginning of World War II. The League of Nations, which had failed to avert the outbreak of this war, was disbanded and replaced by United Nations Organization UNO in 1945. Questions. Why did the League of Nations fail to achieve the aims of its founders? The League of Nations was bound to fail in achieving its aims. Discuss. How successful was the League of Nations as an instrument of peace in the interwar period? To what extent was the League of Nations successful as an instrument of peace between